Thank you for listening to the Pathway Church audio. For more information about our exciting church, please visit our website at www.thepathwaychurch.tv. We hope to have you join us one Sunday soon. May God richly grow you and challenge you personally through this message.
Here this morning, I am excited to be here as we celebrate today. We celebrate our 1-year anniversary. We're going to go ahead and dismiss the kiddos to go back to the back if you want to. We'll go ahead and get right into it this morning. How many of you guys have, if you've had a good week, whoop, whoop. All right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to lean over and give somebody a high five next to you. Somebody that's next to you, give them a high five this morning. All right, yeah, if you don't want to, that's okay. That's okay. Hey, I'm very excited to be here this morning, and I'm very excited to worship with you guys. God has been so good to us. He's been so good to our church, and He continues to sustain us. If there's nothing else that has been able to be clearly seen this year, it's the fact that God has sustained us through this all. And God is our provision. He's our provider, and since day one, He continues to provide for us and meet all of our needs as a church, and continues to grow us. So this week, we're actually in the second sermon of a series that we're doing called What's Love Got to Do With It, right? Last week, we began a series called What's Love Got to Do With It? And we discussed that memorable song. Whenever I say that phrase, What's Love Got to Do With It? There's a song that comes to mind, right? And we discussed that memorable phrase from the memorable song by Tina Turner, and I'm not going to sing it this week, right? I'm not going to sing it this week, but we're talking about that song by Tina Turner, who officially told us that she believed love was nothing but a second-hand emotion, right? That phrase in the song that love is nothing but a second-hand emotion. And we learned also last week that this guy named Francis Schaeffer, a 20th century theologian and philosopher, said that we can discover when the beliefs of a culture finally hit the mainstream by listening to the lyrics of modern music, right? We can listen to the lyrics of modern music, and we can kind of determine when the ideas of a culture have hit the mainstream, right? So unfortunately, in 1984, Tina Turner, she identified a part of culture, partly as a result of the sexual revolution that took place in the 60s and 70s. This culture that she was living in then was moving away from this idea of true love, of real love. In fact, as Tina said, it had become secondhand emotion, right? A secondhand emotion. Simply put, love was not even worth considering. Love was not even worth considering. Like, it wasn't even a first-hand emotion. It was a second-hand emotion. Right? And as we continue to walk through this, we determine that the Bible deals with this idea and has a very different idea about this idea of love. Right? The Bible deals with things very differently on this idea of love than the way Tina Turner did. The Bible tells us essentially that love is everything. Love is everything. In summary, what Paul tells us in this passage, we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, if you guys want to turn there. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and we're walking through verses 1 through 8. This is a very familiar passage, right? And in summary, what Paul's telling us, we talked about the first 3 verses last week. In summary, what Paul's telling us is that everything minus love equals nothing. I want you to think through that for a second. Everything minus love equals nothing. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 1 says, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but I do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so that I can remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away everything I own, and if I give over my body in order to boast, but do not have love, I receive no benefit." So if we are void of love, we are void of anything that's of worth. If we are void of love, we are void of anything that's of worth. So what's love got to do with it? Everything. Everything. So what is this love that we talk about? This love that puppy love teenagers talk about when they're falling in love with each other. I love you so much. You remember those days, right? When your first love and you fell in love with that 13 or 14-year-old smoking hot boy or girl, and you were like, man, I'm so in love. And don't you know, you really had no idea what it meant back in the day, right? So what is this love that we speak of? We're in the month of February, and we had Valentine's Day last weekend, and we're talking about love, and we're talking about this whole idea of love. What is it? Right? It's cliche. We hear it all the time. I love you. I love this. I love ice cream. I love my wife. Right? There's a difference. What is this love? What I'd like to suggest this morning is maybe there's a better question. Maybe the question we should be asking ourselves is, who is this love? Who is this love? Let's pick up in verses 4 and 5, and that's what we're going to focus on this week in verses 4 and 5. Verse 4, love is patient, love is kind. It's not envious. Love does not brag. It is not puffed up. It is not rude. It is not self-serving. It is not easily angered or resentful. Right? Many or most of us, we've heard this passage before. We've heard it before in a wedding. Maybe we've heard it in a love story. We've heard this passage before. Maybe we didn't even realize that it was being read out of the Bible, but this is a passage of Scripture that can be considered cliche because we've heard it so many times. Love is patient. Love is kind. It's not envious. It does not brag. It is not puffed up. It is not rude. It is not self-serving. It is not easily angered or resentful. Right? And so as a pastor, for me to stand up and preach on this passage, for me to stand up in front of you guys and preach on a passage that seems so cliche, it can be difficult. It can be difficult to talk about something that we've heard time and time and time again, and so often we just take it for granted. We just read through it as if it's something that we've heard a million times and don't actually process the meat of what it is, the meat of what it's saying, right? And so as I was reading this passage, as I'm processing through this passage, I've heard it before, I've read it before, and I'm trying to determine how God wanted me to convey this very familiar passage to you guys today. And that's one of the things I do each week when I'm preparing a sermon, is I'm asking God to show me and to show us a fresh word from the Lord. And so I'm seeking through the Lord, and I really felt like God spoke to me this week. I really felt like God gave me a word from Him for you this week. I heard a word from God, and here's what I heard God say to me. And I felt like that as I'm speaking to God through prayer and I'm praying this week, I felt like God really spoke to me vividly this week. He said, these attributes of love are who I am. These attributes of love that we read of in this passage are who I am. So the better question as we read through this passage is not to ask what is love, but to ask who is love. Right? The action of love is simply this. It is manifested by the who of love. Hear that again. The what of love is manifested by the who of love. Right? So the actions of love that we read of in this passage will be manifested by the one who owns them, by the one who embodies them, by the one who defines them. They will be shown practically in our lives by the one who defines them. If we grow in our lives, if we grow to know the who of love, then the actions of love will flow more naturally in our lives. Right? So if we grow to understand God more, if we grow to understand God on a deeper level, if we study God, if we spend time with God, if we get to know God personally, then those attributes of love, the actions of love that Paul describes in this passage here will be manifested more naturally in our lives. They will flow through us more naturally in our lives. So if you want to know how to love better, if you want to know how to express love better, get to know God more. God said to me this. He said this. He said, these attributes are not the duty of my beloved. They are my personality. We are God's beloved. And oftentimes we look at showing love and demonstrating love as a duty, as an obligation. But I think it's more of allowing God, submitting God, and allowing God to show Himself. Because a lot of times we can show love or we can show attributes of love out of obligation and not really be in love, not really be loving in who we are as a person, right? So in other words, here's the question asked: must we do these things to show our love? These things that Paul talks about. Must we do these things that Paul talks about to show our love? Well, here's what I want to say this morning. It's more about allowing God to show Himself through us. More about allowing God to show Himself through us. So our role is not a role of proactive actions, duties, these types of things. Our role is more of an act of submission. Because when we submit to God, when we give ourselves to God, when we humble ourselves before God and submit ourselves to God and allow Him to work in our lives and allow Him to come and take over our lives and work through us, then that act of submission in and of itself is an act that allows God to manifest His love through us. Allows Him to give Himself to us and work through us. Love simply is this in our lives, is the overflowing of God through us. You see, 1 John 4, chapter 4, verse 8 says, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. When we know God, we know love, and therefore we show our love. Right? So we can ask ourselves this: what does God look like living through us? What does it look like when we know God is living Himself through us? When God is showing Himself strong in us? What does it look like? How does God show Himself in us and through us? How do we know when we are loving God and when we are submitting to God and giving ourselves to God? How do we know? Here's some things that are some factors that we can pinpoint to know if God is showing Himself through us, if we are trusting in God. Some things like patience that we read of in this passage, right? Patience, kindness, not envious, not boastful or prideful, not puffed up. These are some ways that we can identify if God is living Himself through us, right? Most of you know that whenever you have a relationship or you spend time with somebody often or a lot, you begin to pick up characteristics of that person. If you've been married to somebody for a long period of time, you tend to pick up characteristics of that person. Their personality traits, you tend to kind of take some of those personality traits, right? And I've even heard it said before that older couples, as time goes on, when they've been married for 40, 50, 60 years or longer, that they even begin to kind of look alike. Have you heard that before? I don't even remember where I heard that, but that they even begin to kind of look like because their facial expressions begin to mimic themselves. Can I get somebody, Brittany, would you mind going out there? I think Orbit's here. Could you just kind of hang tight? Tell them to hang tight. They keep calling my phone, and I'm trying to preach here. This isn't working out. Right? So they keep... So you kind of tend to mimic that person over time, right? I've even heard it said that you begin to kind of look like that person. Like, I noticed that I'm saying things now that I remember my wife saying back when we first got married. There's certain sayings that we're share now because of the time that we spend together, and the more we get to know each other, the more we begin to mimic that of each other, right? And so that's what tends to take place. Whenever we know God, whenever we grow in that relationship with God, we begin to become more like Him, right? And God is love. And so what Paul's describing here in this passage is these characteristics of love. And so the longer we're in a relationship with God, the more we begin to mimic Him, the more we begin to look like Him, the more we begin to do the things that He does, right? And it's things like Paul mentions here: patience, kindness, not envious, not boastful or prideful, not puffed up. We're not rude or self-serving, not easily angered or resentful. And some of you guys are reading this and you're like, man, there's no way I could ever measure up to this. There's no way I could ever actually live this out. That's kind of the point this morning. That song that we sang talked about when I come to the end of myself. When I come to the end of myself, that's when God can begin to work. And so, in essence, it's not about us trying to be more like God or trying to show these actions that God shows, but us to come to the end of ourselves and allow God to work them through us. Allowing God to work them through us. But we have to come to the point of the end of ourselves. We have to come to the point of submission to give ourselves over to God. And as I'm looking through these different characteristics, these different things, I'm like, man, okay, patience, I get that, right? I get that's an act of love, to show patience. I get that. And to show kindness, right? I get that sounds like an act of love, but not envious, right? And if this is a characteristic of God to not be envious, then why in the Old Testament does it say that God is a jealous God? Why in the Old Testament does it say that God is a jealous God? Have you ever heard that before? Said that God is jealous. He doesn't want us to put anything before Him, that He is a jealous God. And I'm reading this, that it says not envious, and I start to hear a difference between envy and jealousy, right? It says God is not envious, but that in the Old Testament it says that God is jealous. What is the difference between these two? Have you ever thought about that? Like, what is the difference? If God is not envious, but He's jealous, what is the difference? So I started researching it a little bit and found a blog post on Psychology Today. A professor from the University of Kentucky, his name is Dr. Richard Smith, and he discusses the difference, what he believes, and says that most scholars agree that the difference between envy and jealousy is this. Envy occurs when, he says, when we lack a desired attribute that is enjoyed by another. So envy occurs when we lack a desired attribute that somebody else has. Okay? Jealousy, on the other hand, occurs when something that we already possess is threatened by a third person. Something we already possess is threatened by a third person. So God is a jealous God. God is a jealous God, but He is not lacking anything. So He cannot be envious. He's not lacking anything, so He cannot be envious. But He is jealous because when we have this relationship with Him, He does not want that to be compromised with anybody else. Right? And the fact that God is not lacking, and the fact that we are lacking, it should clearly speak to us and cause us to come to the end of ourselves and come after Him and seek after Him, because He is the only one that is completely complete. I'm not sure if that's the proper way to say it. He's completely complete. God is completely complete. He is not self-serving. He's not easily angered. He's not resentful. And so we dig through these things and we talk about patience and kindness in these words. And so this week I'm asking us as a church, our call to action this week is to begin to process these things. Begin to process these characteristics. Begin to get to know God more. And the more we get to know God, the more we will begin to mimic Him. Right? The more we will begin to mimic Him. The reason why I believe that Paul goes into this discourse is to show us what it looks like for God to live Himself through us. I believe that Paul wants to show us what it looks like for God to live Himself through us. Right? He wants to show us what it looks like for God's personality to shine through us. And so as individuals, as Christians, we begin to mimic God, and God begins to shine His way through us, and we begin to show this kind of love to the world in action. We begin to show this kind of love to our spouses. We begin to show this kind of love to our kids. We begin to show this kind of love to our friends and our family and our community. We begin to live this kind of love out in action when we come to the end of ourselves. Right? When we come to the end of all of our pride and we give up all of our pride and we begin to let God live Himself through us. At the end of this passage, as we'll get into more in detail next week, we'll go through the last few verses next week. right? But I want to go ahead and conclude what our message this week is we're going to head out and let the kids have a good time. But I want to conclude that Paul reminds us this. He reminds us this, that God's love, that this love of God will never, ever fail us. It will never, ever fail us. Listen, God's love will never, ever fail you. Whenever we seek after Him and we give up of ourselves, a lot of us times we're so afraid to give up ourselves to God and submit ourselves to God because we lack the faith and we don't trust that He will really shine Himself through us, that He will really provide for us, that He will really take care of us, that He will really walk with us in the difficult times in life. But the truth is God's love never fails us. We can rest in that. We can trust in that. We can have faith in that. Right? So when we submit to God and we show Himself, when we submit to God, God will show Himself strong in us. And so what we're going to do here in a minute is we're going to have a response time. We're going to have a time when we will give you an opportunity to take communion. We do this every week. You guys can walk up and you can observe communion if you'd like to do that. But here's what I would like to do this week is I would like to call everyone in here today to submit to God. To submit our lives to God, to give ourselves over to Him, to allow God's love to shine through us, to allow those things, those characteristics to work through us and to shine through us. And that's what I'm asking this week. That's what I'm asking you to do this week. And so if you'd stand with me, we're going to have a time of response, and I'm going to give you guys an opportunity to respond to God. If you feel the Lord leading you to respond, I'm going to ask you guys to feel free to do that. If you feel like you need to come and pray, I would be happy to pray over you. I would be happy to speak to you. I would be happy to try to encourage you. If you feel the need to pray with somebody else in this room, feel free to go grab somebody and to pray. And what we're going to do is we're going to have just a brief moment of response time as the music plays in the background. We're going to have a brief moment of response time. We're going to take up our offering at the end of the service like we normally do. And so I just want you guys to, if you would, just bow your heads with me real quick, and we're gonna keep this short. I don't want to drag it on, but I do want us this week to consider the God of love, the God who will never fail us. Father, may you speak to our hearts this morning. May we submit to you. If you feel led, even in this moment, submit your heart to the Lord. I'm going to say a prayer. I'm going to pray for you, and then I'm going to ask you to come observe communion if you would like to do that. And if you feel like something is holding you back, if you feel like something is keeping you from allowing God to work through you this morning, I want you to let that go. God, I want the love of God to shine through us. I want this church to be a church that shines the love of God, that God would just work through us, and when people look at us, they would see the love of Jesus Christ. So as I pray, I'm going to pray, and then you guys come take communion. You guys respond. Father, I love you. I thank you for all that you do for us. Father, I thank you so much for this church. God calls us to move, calls us to action, calls us to love, because it is you that gives us that strength. It is you that does that through us. So God, we love you and praise you today. In Jesus' name, let's respond.